Thank you, John. Hello. I remember most of you. I'm just continuing on with Hyde Park Special Effort at Adelaide today. So I understand that you had Sam this morning. Good. He's a good fella, Sam. He's only about this high though, so you need the microphone down. Now, this is a really interesting topic. So we get that these women that are named in this genealogy have got one thing in common, and that was, as John's rightly said, they were forebears of Jesus. They're forebears that in our own genealogies, I reckon some of them at least we'd be loath to include. So we're going to look at what unites them, what ties them together, what things that they have in common. I think it's an amazing topic, and as we tie some of these threads together, I reckon you'll agree with me. Now, they have a whole lot more in common than the Matthew 1 chronology, as you'll see. So while we explore their families, their troubling and uplifting and inspiring stories, it's their background that's common. It's their stories that are common. Their front and their back stories, and together we'll put that on show. So let's put this on. We will press that, and then everything will not be okay because I need to press that. Yay! All right. So we've read that introduction that names these women. So just how many women are named in Matthew 1 in Jesus' 5, says 3, says Dan. Well, this is where, someone's 50% out here. Right, John's got 4. Do we have any advances on 4? Judy's given us 5, Len's given us 5, Dan's given us 3. Keep up, Dan. Okay, well, but the question, dear listener, was how many are named? 4 are named because Bathsheba, we know it's her, is described as the what? Okay, apropos of nothing, we know it's her. Now that's telling us another story, isn't it? This is saying there's a bit of pain here. And pain is another thing which ties these ladies together. So this is what we'll try to get through. Now, I have to tell you that it's going to be really hard work, as you'll see. So here they are. We've got Tamar, tick. We've got Rahab. We've got Ruth. And we've got the wife of Uriah. And then later down, I don't know, in the mid-teens, we see Mary's named. Now, this, of course, in Matthew's record, is the genealogy on Mary's side. And in Luke, we've got the genealogy on Joseph's side. So to try to come up with a methodology to collect all of these commonalities together, I ran with the P theme, so past, present and future people. See, if you're a school teacher, you'd look at this and go, oh, that's what these phones are doing to these kids. They can't spell, but, come on, bear with me. And we'll look at providence. Now, I can't possibly even start to deal with all of the links. So what I'll try to do is maybe just start with an example and then we'll get into it. So this is my framework. So you're doing a good job to sort of break that down. You'll see where the sort of colours are there on the left-hand side. I've got a theme running through and then the names on the top. And then what I'm trying to do is join all of these dots together. So I have taken one of those tonight, but let me just start with an example so you get the thread. I want to talk about the theme of widows. I am hoping that when it comes to the stories of Tamar, which is in Genesis 38, it's not a long story. It's a tough story, but it's not a long story. We know it. And then in Joshua 2, etc., we've got Rahab. And then we've got the story of Ruth, which very interestingly, in the Hebrew Bible, is after the book of Proverbs. I'd like to know why. I'd like to explore that a little bit more. And then we have the story of Bathsheba in 2nd of Samuel. And then obviously the story of Mary in the New Testament. Widows. We know that Tamar was widowed, not once, but twice. Really oddly, God deliberately takes the lives of her two husbands, which were brothers. So much so that the third brother, Judah, as in Jacob's son, refuses to pass on, which was the tradition. We know it as the Levirate tradition. It's not a biblical tradition. Because remember, there is no law of Moses. So this is a cultural tradition. We still have Levirate laws today in some countries. We also have Soperate laws where the same applies on the female side. So she's widowed not once but twice. Ruth, we know that she was married to Elimelech's son, probably second son, Mahlon Chilion. We think it's Chilion. Ruth is a widow. Bathsheba, obviously we know, was a widow. David effectively murdered her husband. Now, it's best guessed that Mary was a widow because we read about Joseph in the story of the family going down, as they did annually, which is quite a long trip. That whole family group came down from the north, went to Jerusalem, but we don't hear about Joseph or read about him anymore after that incident when Jesus was 12 years old. So we assume that Mary was a widow. And you might recall from the last class that while I was here, we spoke about the family relationships. So at Jesus' unveiling, where he turned the water into wine, it was probably a family wedding. Mary was the one who was running the show, looking after catering at least. And she says to Jesus, turn this water into wine. Now, I've missed one, haven't I? I've missed Rahab. There's no evidence at all that Rahab was a widow. So then we have to think about who she was and how the Bible describes her and why. So every time throughout the Bible that we read her name, we know that she is described as Rahab the harlot. As I said, if we go to Ancestry.com and we track back a few hundred years and we discovered that one of our forebears, that was their profession, it's something that we might want to erase. God doesn't do that. God emphasises it because God loves everyone and there's a chance for everyone. It doesn't matter what we've done. Believe me, stick with me, and I'll find a place for you in my kingdom. That's God's message. But she was a prostitute. Well, why do people become prostitutes? It's security, isn't it? It's the only way that they can find to put bread on the table. But why? Many times that financial lack of security occurred because they did not have a husband. So this is an enormous story in the life of Tamar. Not only did she have shame for not being able to bear a son to not one but two husbands. So in Rahab's case, I am guessing that because the other four women were widowed, that she was. Now you might say, well, James, that's a guess. And it is. But it's 4 out of 5 is still a pretty good number. So this is what we've got to look at tonight. We'll see how far we get. Now, Dada, love it. She's told me I've got till, I said, how long, Dada? She said 5-2. I said, good. We'll be done at about 5 to 10. So the story, we'll look at this sort of, there is a nasty, uncomfortable background to all of these ladies that we'll look at. We'll look at this idea of being comforted, what that meant. We'll have a look at how kings and royalty, how that related to these amazing ladies. We'll also look at this topic of being righteous or faithful, and then we'll have a look at promises, pledges, and oaths. Oaths. So, as I've mentioned, the story of Tamar in particular is a wretched one. She costumes up as a prostitute, but not any type, a cult shrine prostitute. She does this in order to sleep with her father-in-law. This is a story that if we have the grandkids around and we're doing the readings, we might just want to see what's going on in Matthew or the Psalms. Like, it's a hard, nasty story. Women, put yourselves in the shoes of Tamar and think about how hard her life must have been for that to have been an even imagined option, let alone something that she planned and she executed. Which, by the way, that union God blesses. That is another amazing theme that unites these ladies. Yeah, there she is. She is in the line of Jesus. She is comforted with a child. She is not only that, she is called righteous. And all of these events occur because wisely she sought a surety. She sought a promise. So the story goes like this. Hello there, young lady. My name's Bill. I'd like to use your services. How much? Oh, well, she says the price. Oh, I haven't got my wallet. It must be a Mansfielder. I don't know. I haven't got my wallet. What can I give you? And she looks carefully and she says, well, that bracelet you have, that I'll take that. And I noticed that it's got a special signet. What's that? Oh, well, if I'm signing a contract, everyone knows it's me because it's very special. It's made of metal. Please don't lose it if you want it. Well, I do want it. Oh, and your staff. Well, you can't take my staff. Why not? Well, it's got my name on it. I want that. So as part of her contractual arrangements, because he can't pay, she seeks these things as a guarantee. 3 months later, it's discovered she's pregnant. Judah then wishes to bring her out to make a public spectacle and decides that the penalty for this crime is to burn her like a Salem witch. Now, there are very, very few times in the Bible where burning anyone for any reason is granted by God. In fact, it was a practice often done by the Canaanites as an act of devotion. A child was burnt. So terrible. Quietly, discreetly, she passes on these 3 things to a go-between and says, whoever owns these is the father of my child. He then says, yikes-a-rooney, I wasn't expecting this. Your righteousness has exceeded mine. Now, that is a summary of the story of Genesis 38. As a consequence of that story, Boaz is told by the men, after he very cleverly secures a massive debt to take over Elimelech's and Naomi's property, and by virtue of that arrangement, secure Ruth for a wife, says, well, the men say to him, well, we hope that your family is a success, just like the family of Tamar's kids. So Pharez, who was the firstborn child, was born in a very unusual circumstance because, well, he wasn't the firstborn, was he? Again, another weird thing happens. Like she's giving birth. So men have got no idea. I've got no idea about this. And it's not something I'd want to Google. Giving birth, kid number 1 sticks his hand out, so they quickly tie a red cord around his hand, goes back in. Anyway, the other kid shoots out, and then the kid with the thing shoots out, and he's got this red cord. Well, this is weird, because he came out first, but he's second. There's all sorts of weird stuff that happened with the patriarchs. But she was blessed because she then had not 1, but 2 children that she could love and cherish, and as she grew older, could provide security for her. Now remember, Judah is the dad, so after this incident, there's a famine and he's off in Egypt, and there's this story with his brothers and trying to get Joseph, and then the whole family moves over to Egypt. So the whole nuance is just absolutely spectacular. Okay, that was an introduction. So that is one component of one of these elements. So let's have a look at this concept. I've taken one of my little coloured thingamybobbies and I've said, okay, let's have a look at this distasteful past. Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba and Mary. They actually, all of them have got a dubious past. The first two, I can't call it anything else but grubby. I mean, what Tamar did, it just makes you feel ill. So Tamar, we've explained what's happened. Rahab, we've explained that her vocation, and the way that the Bible describes her consistently is that she was always a prostitute. But the backstory to Tamar's decision-making is because of the way that her husbands, who were Judah's first two sons, treated her. There are very few occasions when God decides to take a life, and in this family, he takes not only the firstborn son, but the second-born son. So obviously what these two boys were doing was vile to God. And when we have a look at the very rare incidents where God takes life, it's generally one of two reasons, isn't it? It's got something to do with extremely bad morality, think Sodom and Gomorrah, or it's got something to do with very bad worship, think the sons of Korah, Dathan and Abiram. The earth swallows them up. So perhaps it was a bit of both. Because the second son who God takes, we're told why God took his life. Almost. You see, what the second son was doing was wanting his cake and eating it too. So the Levirate law, firstborn son dies, secondborn son fills the shoes to produce an heir so the firstborn son's name can continue. So he's having sex with Tamar, but he's using the rhythm method, and it says he spilled his seed to the ground. How often did this happen? Was it every time? First time? It was often enough for God to say, I'm hearing your cries, Tamar. I can see what's going on. His life is forfeit. Now, more than likely, the reason for this was just utter greed. I don't think an act of contraception in itself is wrong, but the motive behind it was because he stood, there was three brothers, one's dead, so there's two of them. So he's got a 50-50 inheritance, right? But if he produces a kid, his inheritance drops to 33 because there's the heir, the name continues. So for 17% of an estate, he decides to treat this woman like this. All she wanted was a kid. God says, no, your life's forfeit. So, And sorry, I'm being a bit explicit. I mean, it's the story, isn't it? This is what the Bible is telling us. So sometimes we have a look at Rahab's background and we say, oh, well, it's possible she was an innkeeper. Don't be fooled, she was no innkeeper. It's a wrong word, no. That's what she was. That's what she did as a vocation. She was a prostitute. But there's also the questionable past of Ruth, Rahab and Mary. Naomi says to Ruth, I have a plan. Boaz is my near kinsman. What I want you to do is after he's had his end of financial year party, he's probably going to have a few drinks. In the middle of the night, slip under his covers. Now, that's a pretty bold plan to invent, but it's an even bolder thing to implement. And Ruth does it. Boab, probably a bit dry of palate, crusty of voice, feels something at the bottom of his bed. What's going on? Rips his cover. What are you doing here? No, it's just me. Oh, he says. And then she explains. Now, it's questionable, but Ruth wasn't trying to sneak under the covers with Boaz for dodgy reasons. That wasn't it at all. The language Boaz uses is unbelievably beautiful. You've come under the protection of my wings, he says, as if Ruth really has embraced the covenant of the hope of Israel. We can all have a perception about what happened with Bathsheba. I'll give you mine. I think she was a victim of a king who had power and she had none. Now, I think if we put ourselves again into Bathsheba's shoes, she's having a bath. We're told that David should have been out with his men, but he's having a bit of R&R at home. He spots her and he sees what he likes. It is highly unlikely this is the first time he has cast an eye on Bathsheba, because Bathsheba is married to Uriah, one of his chief military men, living very close to David so David can see the roof of his house. Probably went to the wedding. I don't think he gave the bride away, because we know that Bathsheba has relatives. The problem with the relatives is another link that ties these women together. I think it's a bit unfair to say that Bathsheba was complicit. I think if you're a woman in this society and there's a king, I think we can give her the benefit of the doubt. Now, I could be wrong on that. That's just how I read it. In Jesus' time, no one gave Mary the benefit of the doubt, including her fiancé. I think when God chose Mary and effectively Joseph to be the bearers of his son, these are two very unique people, like very unique. It's rare feet like theirs have trodden the earth. Imagine Joseph's heartbreak when he discovers that his lamb is having a baby and he knows it's not his. So again, the Bible's language on this is really beautiful. Joseph meant to put her away privily. He could have demanded execution. No, he was an honourable person. I don't know the background, he says to himself. I don't know what's happened. All I know is the outcome. And so an angel has to say, hey, Joseph, relax. You might need to sit down for the next bit of the story. And so they get married and they live happily ever after, and they have all sorts of children. But that cloud, that stigma of a murky past hung around. The Pharisees say to Jesus, we know our father, we know where we came from. We weren't born of fornication like you were. This is 30 years after the event. So you see how the stories around these women are similar. Let's have a look at promises, pledges and oaths. So we've explained the signet and the bracelet and the staff. Now, even the words that Tamar uses when she demands these sureties, the deposit, I suppose, if you like, is a petition. So there's sort of an idea of a legal contract. So many years ago, I had to do contract law. It was like one of the first subjects at good old University of South Australia. And I remember there was 5 components to a contract, and it's like there had to be an offer, there had to be an acceptance, there had to be consideration, there had to be an intent, and paying a deposit. So if you're going to buy a car, they get you to sign a contract. You always have to pay a deposit. Why? Like sometimes you might buy a car for 50 grand and you got to give us $100 for deposit. Oh, okay. Here's 100. then you get charged like 2.5% on your credit card for the deposit, but you've given them $102.50 and the car's yours, because that's how our contract law works. So we get that story. We know that's what she did. What about in the story of Rahab? Well, in the story of Rahab, she is a particularly amazing woman. She knew that the God of Israel was the one true God. In her story, she recites 38 and a bit years worth of history and uses language that even prophets quote. I know that your God took your people out through the Red Sea. I know that your God destroyed the Egyptians. I know what your God did to Sidon and Og. We are all petrified. Yeah, well, our God did do that, the two spies say. You make me a pledge. So she asks for a contract. Swear an oath and save me and my family. And that's exactly what happened. As long as what? See, there's an offer, there's acceptance, but the intent was the important bit here. I will save you, says the spies. We will keep you safe as long as. See, there's a term. Keep all your family in the house. And so whoever was in that house survived. What was a deposit? Think about Hebrews 11. She has faith. We'll get to that in just a moment. The story of Ruth, there's a couple of pledges that Boaz gives. So in chapter 2, he notices her and he says to his supervisor, who's this woman? And the supervisor knows all about her. He says, right, it could be dangerous for her if she goes to another field. Make sure that she stays with us. Look after her. Don't let the men upset her. Give her something to eat. And then Boaz has that direct conversation with her. He says, you stay with me and I promise to keep you safe. So here's part of the pledge story. But that isn't the pledge story of Ruth. This is the pledge. I'll start, you finish. Whither thou, there will I. Whither thou lodges, I've given you the clue. Whither thou, there will I. Thy shall be. And whither thou diest, there will I. Okay, so this is her pledge to Naomi. And she fulfilled it. She followed Naomi, didn't she? Every step of the way. Call me bitter. My life is ruined, she says to all her friends when she goes home to Bethlehem. So that's an amazing display of loyalty, but it's not the pledge. It's not the pledge with meaning. Think about this. How does Naomi know that Ruth keeps her word when she says, where you die, there will I die? Think carefully about that. Naomi is dead and buried in the ground. Years later, decades later, next to her, Ruth gets buried. That is a promise. That is a woman of integrity. Naomi never knew that Ruth would maintain that promise. We don't know either. We don't know. But I would suspect, based on Ruth's character, that's what she did. See that plot of ground there? She says to her children and grandchildren, well, that's where your grandma was buried, and that plot next to her, that's mine. Where you die, there will I die. That is an amazing pledge. Now, with Mary, there can be no greater promiser than God. The Lord himself will give you a sign. This is the promise God gave the world. A virgin shall conceive See how that idea of a promise and a pledge ties all of these women together. All right, so you're probably getting the hang of it now. So let's talk about this idea of being comforted. So Proverbs says something I think is really quite nice. Gracious words are a honeycomb, sweet to the soul and healing to the bones. And that was what those men said to Boaz when he was able to secure, by his brainiacal cleverness, this plot of land, this massive debt, and this beautiful woman, Ruth. But what they said was really important. The beautiful words were, "May your family, Boaz," who was an older man, "be blessed like Tamar's family. Be blessed like the house of Pharez." Now, how was Rahab comforted? Let's have a look at this one. Now, we need to go over to Isaiah. Oh, I think it's Isaiah 51, actually. Let me have a look. Isaiah, Jeremiah. How are we going, Dido? 6:32. Isaiah, Jeremiah 51. We're going to have a look at verse 9. I'm looking for the word. Yeah, beautiful. Now, I have to go old school on the King James Version here. Dan says, Now, clearly I'm taking a bit of license with this comfort idea, because when the term Rahab is used in Isaiah, it can mean a number of different things, and it looks like this is particularly referring to a man. But in Isaiah 30, Rahab refers to Egypt. But let's listen to these words. "Awake, awake, put on strength." This is verse 9 of Isaiah 51. "O arm of the Lord, awake as in the ancient days, in the generations of old. Art thou not it that hath cut Rahab and wounded the dragon?" So I'm taking license because Rahab's name is used and there's a reference to ancient times. Now, I would say that when Isaiah's talking, in context, he's talking like I'm talking to you. But I love this idea that the notion of being comforted and Rahab are linked. Have a look now at verse 11. "Therefore, the redeemed of the Lord shall return and come with singing unto Zion, and everlasting joy shall be upon their head. They shall obtain gladness and joy, and sorrow and mourning shall flee away. I, even I, am he that comforteth you. Who art thou, that thou shouldest be afraid of a man that shall die, and of the Son of Man, which shall be made as grass?" So, yes, I am taking a little bit of license. Can I just bring your attention to verse 10? "Art thou not it which hath dried the sea, the waters of the great deep, and hath made the depths of the sea a way for the ransomed to pass over?" Those are the words of Rahab. Joshua 2 verse 10. "We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for when you came out of Egypt." Rahab. So you see how there's a tie? Now you might say to me, "Oh, James, that's a bit stretchy," and that's perfectly okay. Let me give you a little bit more evidence that this theme of comforted is something that unites these 5 women. Ruth chapter 2 verse 13. "You have comforted me and spoken kindly." In the story of Bathsheba, 2 of Samuel 12 and verse 24, then David comforted his wife. Why did she need comfort? Well, the loss of a child, no matter how young, is never forgotten. It's a hurt that runs very deeply. And what repairs that broken heart? Well, at least goes part the way. Well, she has a son, and that son's called Solomon. Not her only child. She has several more. And if you total up the children of Tamar, 2, Ruth, 1, Rahab, 1, Bathsheba, 4, equals 8. So therefore, I think Jesus was one of 5 brothers and 3 sisters. The sum of the kids equal New Testament and Old. In the story of Mary, so Mary as a mum, it would have been a real contrast to, I think, to have raised Jesus as a baby and a sort of, you sort of picture Jesus as a child being this amazingly obedient kid, do your dishes, Jesus, no worries. Tidy your room, Jesus. Yes, it's already tidy. Simeon, do your dishes. No, I'm not doing the dishes. You imagine all of these other 7 kids being rat bags, but Jesus being the one that's obedient. So in Luke chapter 4 and verse 22, it says this. All bore witness to him, and they marvelled at his gracious words. And they say, oh, this is a bit over the top. We know this kid. Isn't this Joseph's son? Now, of course, the fact was, Jesus was Mary's son and not Joseph's. It was Jesus who introduced the concept of a comforter. Jesus always knew the right thing to say and when. There is no one better that could speak comforting words ever in history. He could say, daughter, be of good comfort. Thy faith has saved thee, in Luke chapter 8, verse 48. So I suspect that as a parent, when you hear that your child has done so well that the community is praising them, if there's one word it would give you comfort. Oh, well, I got 1 out of 8 right. Oh. So I think about that and I think, yeah, I get it. I reckon that theme works, that Mary's included in this story of comforting. Okay, so, story of kingship. All right. So, Tamar is married to Judah. At the end of Jacob's life, he's blessing all of his children. And he gives them blessing A and blessing B and blessing C and blessing D. He comes to Judah and he describes Judah, as this lion's whelp, because the king would come from the tribe of Judah, the king. Now, if we remember the story of Rahab, we remember that the king is going backwards and forwards. There's people coming knocking on Rahab's door. Hey, we're here and there's spies. Have you seen them? No, I think they went that way. All right, no worries. And so off they go. The king, I sort of get the feeling that in this town, Rahab and the king were in cahoots. And it makes sense because visitors would go and visit Rahab and she could sort of tap them for gossip. What's going on? Has anyone read the Francine Rivers books? Anyone heard of those? They're sort of, they're fictional accounts of the story of these women, and they're really close to the Bible stories, but she's used her imagination to sort of fill in some of the gaps. What she says of the story of Rahab is this. It's her sort of imagination that she's an attractive child. So remember the city of Jericho, it's a safe city, it's walls. It's virtually impenetrable, really. I mean, without God's hand, that city would have taken years to have been besieged. But it wouldn't have been a big town, somewhere in the hundreds, maybe the early thousands, but not particularly big. This is her take. As an attractive child, she enters the king's harem at a young age. In biblical times, most women were married sort of at 12 or 13 or 14. But this concubine was no shrinking violet. She makes a proposal to the king. "Set me up near the main city gate and I will work as a courtesan." The king says, "Well, what's in it for me? I will share all the secrets that I learn." So she has a house, a prosperous living, and an illusion of independence, but a hole in her heart. So that is this sort of view of how Rahab might have come into this industry. Now, bear in mind, of course, that she had family in the town, and the family aren't looking after her. Ultimately, she has to protect the family by bringing them into her walls. I was racking my brain a bit to see, well, how does this idea of a king relate to Ruth? I could sort of invent, there's a few generations and David's born, but, well, then it just dawned on me that her father-in-law's name means, "My God is king." Tick. Move on. Bathsheba. She obviously is not only married to the king, she becomes the mother of the king. And when the angel is talking to Mary, she describes the role of Jesus ultimately is taking on the throne of his father Jacob. And actually, there is another reference, the throne of his father David in Luke chapter 1 verse 32. But I think there is another reference that circles back to the story of Judah where it says that Jesus would take on the throne of his father Jacob. Okay, so I think this will be the last one or thereabouts for tonight. Let's have a look at this idea of being righteous and faithful. So in Genesis 38, Judah said, "She is more righteous than I, since I wouldn't give her to my third son, Shelah." And then it says, thankfully, "and he did not sleep with her again." How do we reconcile this idea that after what Tamar has done, she's called righteous? Well, I think we can reconcile it because it's not God talking, it's not an angel talking, it's Judah talking. So if I think about the righteousness of Jesus, that's the highest bar. I think about the righteousness of the faithful mentioned in Hebrews 11. If Jesus is up here, we've got to ratchet it down a bit, but they're all in the kingdom, they're all described as faithful. And then I think about Judah's righteousness. Well, I think Judah is somewhere down here. And again, I get it. He had been widowed. He had lost his sons. But I don't know whether that incident with Tamar was his first rodeo. So, yes, it's what she did was right, but it's Judah talking and sort of Tamar's here. Regardless, she is still in the line of Jesus. So Hebrews 11 verse 31. Let's have a little bit of a brainstorm about that. Well, Hebrews 11, as we know, is an amazing chapter, the honour roll of the faithful. She's a prostitute, but to be fair, did she know any different as a Canaanite woman? I mean, is there a right or a wrong here? She doesn't know what God's morals are. She knows that God exists and she's a passionate believer. But she also told like a fistful of lies, didn't she? Even if the motive was right, she was protecting those spies. Oh, no, the spies aren't here. Cross my heart, the spies aren't here. If you go down that way, you'll find it. Any lie's a lie, that's a sin. So how do we reconcile this? By faith, it says, and I'm quoting from the NIV, by faith, the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. So her act of faith was protecting them. It's almost like she was expecting them. She's in Hebrews 11. God has found a place for her in his kingdom. So, Ruth is a woman of amazing integrity. You know, where you go, I will follow. Where you live, I'll live there. I'll support you. Where you die, I'll be buried with you. So I would say that statement alone in itself is the statement of a faithful woman. But it wasn't the only time she demonstrated her integrity. So the supervisor of Boaz's field gave quite strict rules. When you come into this field, don't you interfere with them over there. You need to stay right here and in this corner. And then later on, Boaz very generously says, look, if you see that lady over there, she's really looking after a mum that's got nothing. When you've got a handful of grain, just leave it behind, let her pick it up. So I think there was this immediate attraction with Boaz. But later, in the incident where she's caught under the covers, Boaz has explicit instructions for her. You know, do this, she did it, do that, she did it, do that. She followed instructions. I think she was just a person of faith. Now, Psalm 32, verse 11. So I think from memory, after the incident with David and Bathsheba, I think there was 4 or 5 psalms written. I can't remember the exact number. Someone might have it in the margin. But one of those refers to faithfulness in Psalm 32. And when we think about Mary and how she's described, for God to have chosen that amazing woman to be the mother of his son, to be his handmaid, you would think that she was everything, including faithful. So, thus endeth the first part of this little journey, which I think for me is going to be like an amazing, inspiring exercise, looking for these things that tie these ladies together. And long as my nature, I'll probably get a few that are wrong, and I'm happy to be corrected. Sometimes I'm searching for something that isn't quite there. But I'd like to leave you with one final one. So we've described that red cord that was tied around the hand of Tamar's twin. Red cord. Okay. Now, does that sound familiar? What story do we hear about a red cord? Okay, and we know that well, right? So there's this red rope that's sort of out the window. So, well, that's lovely. That's tied these 2 women together. Bathsheba has 2 baths in this story. The first bath is called a bath. She was having a wash. The second bath is called a purification. This was a process after intercourse that men and women did. It was a prescription under the law. There was a purification process. But you won't find any definition of what had to be done. We do find a purification process, however, for priests. So if I'm just looking up the word purification, how do I do it? Like, do I hop on one leg and, have a herb? Or am I washing? Well, there obviously is some washing because she's in a bath, right? So there's obviously something going on. Well, why do you need water? Well, let's have a look at just a moment for the priest purification. Firstly, it involves hyssop. It involves a lamb. It involves blood. So when we think about a lamb, blood and hyssop, what do we immediately think about? The Passover. Brilliant. Who's the Passover? Jesus. So we've got Jesus in the story. What did the priest have to do? The priest had to get wool and dip it in blood. So, as a purification process, if Bathsheba had to do the same thing, in her hand, she had a handful of scarlet thread. Now, I mentioned before that in the Jewish Bible, Ruth appears after the book of Proverbs. This is the reason why. Proverbs 31 is a beautiful chapter, the proverb of the virtuous woman, written by Solomon about his great-great-great-grandmother, Ruth. Who can find a virtuous woman? Her price is far above rubies. Now, the reason why the Jewish Bible changes the order in comparison to sort of English Bibles and King James is because that word and idea, virtuous woman, is rare. But of course, it is used by Boaz to describe Ruth. You, he says, are a noble, virtuous / warrior woman. So when we think about all of those tasks that she did, the independence that she showed, the industry, the fact that she was respected by her neighbours and kid, you get it. So look at that amazing proverb in the future through the lens of Ruth. Because her price was far above rubies. What colour are rubies? Scarlet. Thank you.